Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm going to be looking at Tudor rebellions. Now this is an overview for our coursework unit on the Tudors, and so I'm going to go through essentially all the different rebellions that take place during the Tudor period, and there's quite a lot of them. So as I've said, this video is going to look at the rebellions. I'm going to try and do it fairly briefly. I'm going to go through them chronologically. And what I'm going to do as I go through them is I'm going to highlight the causes that they are most associated with, and some of them are going to have a range because some of them are a bit more complicated than others and are kind of multifaceted in the causation. So I've broken it down roughly into social and economic, religion, politics, and regime change. So regime change is kind of the extreme end of politics, where the rebels are actually trying to remove the monarch. Now, social and economic, a lot of that focuses around things like enclosure and obviously taxes, which are one of the causes of rebellion during this period, and general social and economic hardship. There's also mixed into this. There's a bit of a clash between the classes, particularly seen during Kett's Rebellion. Religion is incredibly significant, particularly from Henry VIII forward, because we have at the beginning of this the whole England is Catholic, and then we see the growth of Protestantism. We see Henry splitting from the Catholic Church, and then we've got Edward, who's Protestant, Mary, who's Catholic, Elizabeth, who's Protestant, and therefore the group who aren't represented religiously by the monarch are more likely to rebel. So this video is part of a series that will look at all aspects you need to do this particular A-level history piece of coursework, and I will add more that will look at the individual themes, so concentrating on socioeconomics, concentrating on religion, or concentrating on politics. I'm going to do some which look at individual monarchs. I'm going to look at some that look at historians' interpretations, and some that look at primary sources in more detail. And then there's also a range of things already on my NEA coursework playlist that'll help you with some of the fundamental basics of getting started and the key bits that you need to do. Henry VII then. Well, Henry VII, unsurprisingly, early on in his reign, faces a large amount of rebellion. Well, this is expected because Henry has just seized the throne on the battlefield at Bosworth, and essentially this is seen as the end of the War of the Roses. So he is House of Lancaster. The War of the Roses was fought between the House of Lancaster and the House of York, and therefore there are going to be Yorkists who have essentially lost and are looking to change the monarch and get rid of Henry VII. First of these, we see the Lovell Rebellion. Again, this is about politics and regime change. Francis Lovell was a Yorkist and former councillor of Richard III. He took sanctuary in Colchester and then goes to Yorkshire, and he raises troops. Essentially, he's looking to attack Henry as he travelled on a progress. The rebellion is fairly easily suppressed. It is connected to another rebellion in the same year. Often historians look at these two together, where you've got the Stafford Rebellion. Again, this is about politics and potential regime change. It takes place in Worcestershire. Again, it's fairly easily suppressed. The Staffords again were Yorkists, so this feeds back to Bosworth. In 1485, Humphrey Stafford was executed. His brother Thomas was pardoned. There is an incredible number of people called Thomas as we go through the Tudor period. The next rebellion, which again starts in 1486, goes into 87, it is known as the Seminal Rebellion. This is the first of the Pretender Rebellions. So these are a slight oddity, really, where we've got people who are pretending to be important people but aren't actually in themselves particularly significant, and they become the kind of focus of the rebellion. Now, there seems to be more that they are pawns in the hands of other people rather than actually the leading figures. So it's called the Seminal Rebellion because the focus on it is on a guy called Lambert Simnel, who was pretending to be the Earl of Warwick. He was actually crowned as King Edward in Ireland in 1487, but the driving force behind the rebellion was John de la Pole, who was a Yorkist. He was the Earl of Lincoln and was nephew of Richard III. So ultimately, potentially, he could have wanted to seize the throne. I mean, in a slightly odd way that they're putting Seminal up first. Now, this rebellion is more serious than the other ones, mainly because it gained support from abroad, notably from Margaret of Burgundy, again, who is a Yorkist. Burgundy is a country in Europe, and she supplied 2,000 mercenaries to support the Seminal Rebellion. Henry defeated the rebels at the Battle of Stoke Field, also known as the Battle of East Stoke. De la Pole, the Earl of Lincoln, was killed in battle. Seminal was actually just given a job in the king's kitchen. He was seen that, again, he wasn't the driving force of the rebellion. He was just someone who'd been picked out because of the way he looked. He actually ends up as the king's chief falconer. So he ends up with a career in the king's service. So a slightly odd one, but with the timing of when it comes early in Henry's reign, was really quite a serious one, particularly with foreign troops arriving from abroad. And while Henry knew that he won the crown on the battlefield, it was always a possibility with the kind of random and chance of battle that he could have lost it on the battlefield near Stoke as well. The next of the rebellions I'm going to look at is 1489, and it's the Yorkshire Rebellion. This is a socio-economic one. The people of Yorkshire were unwilling to pay tax that was set up to fund a war with France. Again, people of Yorkshire kind of looked to where they were and where France was, and that would really affect us. And that's kind of a symbolic, really, of the fact that obviously we think of England as a united place, but in terms of the Tudor period, although England was a single realm, and Wales included in it as well, the Tudors' control of different bits of England varied quite dramatically. And Yorkshire is one of the ones where the Tudors in particular did struggle, and we'll see rebellions taking place and been focused in Yorkshire throughout the period. The rebels killed the Earl of Northumberland to show quite how serious they were, but they were then later defeated by the King's army. Sir John Egremont, who was kind of the leader of the Yorkshire Rebellion, managed to escape to France. The next rebellion is the Wolbeck Rebellion. Now, this is the most long-winded. It drags on for an incredible length of time. So it starts around 1491 and keeps on going on and off until Wolbeck's execution in 1499. Again, this is about politics and regime change. Perkin Wolbeck was another pretender. He was pretending to be Richard, Duke of York. He gained support from Sir William Stanley, who was Lord Chamberlain, a key figure in Henry's government, and actually married to Henry's mum, which was a bizarre reward he was given after joining Henry at the Battle of Bosworth. And then there was also support for Wolbeck at various points from various courts around Europe, including France and Scotland, kind of key enemies or key threats to England. Now, Henry, through various means, managed to negotiate to stop ongoing support. So we see a marriage alliance made with Scotland. We see again marriage alliance and treaty made with France, and essentially once they've got what they want, the European leaders' support for Wolbeck disappears. And there was support for Wolbeck at various points in Ireland and in Cornwall, but he failed to really raise much support at all in England. So he was more of a threat as an idea and someone who was kind of travelling around Europe trying to find people to back him, than actually in reality on the ground in England. So he does land in Cornwall. He doesn't gain enough support, and he's quite easily captured in 1497. Again, he would have probably had a similar fate to Seminal and just gone into the king's service, and all would have been forgiven. But he then escapes and joins plots against the king again, and then is executed in 1499. So Wolbeck, often seen as a serious threat, but partly because of how long it went on, and partly because, again, a potential foreign intervention. But this is something that Henry dealt with quite effectively. Now we then see the Cornish Rebellion, and this is like the Yorkshire one, but the other way round in terms of how the government, the king was trying to raise taxes to pay for war with Scotland. And if you know your English geography, you'll know that the Cornish are unlikely to be worried about the Scots. There's a huge distance between them, and so they want to pay. They didn't want to pay for this war. There are various other socio-economic gripes and complaints, and they marched on London, and they've got as far as Blackheath, where they were defeated. Now, again, because it ends up in battle, and because they get close to London, then the Cornish Rebellion can be seen to have some significance. Now, whilst Henry VII's rebellions, or rebellions against Henry VII, are really just a mixture of social and political reasons, we'll see more of a mix when we get into Henry VIII. And we'll particularly start to see from this point onwards religion become more significant. But in the early part of his reign, it's very much continuation from the reign of Henry VII. So we see another rebellion about a tax, essentially the Amicable Grant, which was Wolsey's attempt. Wolsey was the chief minister to Henry at the time, which was an attempt to raise money to pay for a war with France. There's protests across the country, notably in Suffolk. But again, this was partly a matter of people not wanting to or not being able to pay the tax that they were asked for. It causes problems between Henry and Wolsey, a bit of a humiliating climb down. So this suggests that actually this rebellion has a degree of kind of strength behind it in terms of the ideas, but the government kind of realised, well, maybe this is a slightly unfair tax in the way that we've done it, and partly in the fact that there's a government climb down. We then see again the beginning of problems which we're going to run all the way through from here, which is problems in Ireland. So we see the Silk and Thomas Rebellion, which runs 34 to 37. It's led by Thomas O'Neill, often referred to as Silk and Thomas, and his 5 uncles, following the arrest of Thomas's father, the Earl of Kildare, who was then held in the Tower of London. And again, the rebellion is not hugely successful, and all those leaders are brought to London and executed. But Ireland will continue to be a problem running from this point forward for the Tudors. The biggest rebellion in the time of the Tudors was against Henry VIII, and it was the Pilgrimage of Grace. Now, in this, we have all 3 elements kind of mixed together, and this is one where there's the most kind of historical debate and analysis about causation and what's behind it. So we've got religion, we've got politics, we've got social and economic reasons behind it. And actually, the Pilgrimage of Grace, again, really weird name for a rebellion, but it shows the kind of religious connotations of it. It's a combination actually of some separate uprisings, one in Lincolnshire, a major one in Yorkshire, and in some of the other northern counties as well. Probably the key leader was a guy called Robert Aske, who was the leader in Yorkshire. It's religious because it challenged religious reforms, notably the dissolution of the monasteries, but also the general split from Rome. It was also fueled by socio-economic issues and a lot of the socio-economic problems in the north in particular, and the poverty that was being found there. There was also political elements to it, in this case not necessarily wanting to unseat Henry, but definitely wanting to unseat his key advisor at the time, was a guy called Thomas Cromwell. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that Henry had to seek a kind of a peaceful resolution at one point, because a much bigger rebel army faced a royal army just on the outskirts of Doncaster, and essentially the people there looked at it and went, we're not going to win this battle. And so they kind of sued for peace and held things up. Robert Aske actually went down and spent Christmas with the king. But in the end, as it became clear the rebels' demands were not going to be met, there was a further outbreak of rebellion, and Henry used this as an excuse. Now it was less well organised and wasn't in the form of one great big army, to go and ruthlessly crush it, and it led to the execution of over 200 people. Edward is not on the throne for a very long time, so he comes to the throne in 1547. He's only on the throne to 1553. But he faces 2 rebellions, and one of the things that's really notable with the rebellions against Edward is that they take place at basically the same time. So there's 2 rebellions in 1549. The first of these is referred to as the Western Rebellion, often referred to in writing about it as the Prayer Book Rebellion, which tells you immediately that there's going to be religion in this, and there's also social and economic factors in this as well. So the people involved, the rebels in this, are largely from Cornwall and Devon, and they besieged Exeter, and they demanded changes be made to the prayer book, and because actually the changes Edward had made to the prayer book, they demanded that they get removed, and the prayer book goes back to how it always been, and they were objecting to the Protestant elements that Edward had insisted be instigated in this prayer book. Somerset had actually tried to make sure that this was as mild as it possibly could be. The king would further push for change to the prayer book again in 1552. It's not all about religion, though. Despite the name, the Prayer Book Rebellion, there was also issues over taxes on sheep and wool. It ended in 2 battles, and Edward's forces triumphed. Again, the rebels weren't organised in preparation, really, for taking on a royal army. The other rebellion in 1549 is Kett's Rebellion. This is socio-economic in its foundations, and it is an odd one, really, because Kett wasn't actually protesting against the king or anything the king had done, but merely pointing out some wrongs that were being done and asking the king to do something about it. So Kett and his supporters were protesting against illegal enclosure and other actions of the landowners and other changes to agriculture that were taking place. This is largely in Norfolk, and one of the things that they do is they take control of Norwich. Again, something slightly odd. You talk about Norwich, and you talk about it in the modern world, you might not think it is a massively insignificant place, but it was actually the second biggest place in England behind London, a long way behind London, but it was a really significant city at this point in time. So the rebels aren't against Edward's religious reforms. In fact, actually quite a lot of the rebels are following his kind of Protestant ideas. They even notably sang "God Save the King" as they marched. The main camp was on Mousehold Heath, just outside the walls of Norwich. But this camp and the rebellion collapsed after the defeat at the Battle of Dussindale. Kett and other leaders were hanged. And there's an argument that the combination of these 2 rebellions made 1549 the worst year in Tudor England, where kind of social order looked like it was collapsing. And we really, and I feel sorry for getting away for not only the people involved, but also for Edward in this, that really what we're seeing here is that the hangover from the economic policies or economic disaster, which was his father, which meant the crown finances were rather tight, but also meant that there was quite a widespread economic suffering, but we're starting to see this continuation again of the religious issues as well. And in that, you've got to look at Edward as well. I mean, there are different views on Edward because, remember, he's only 9 when he becomes king. But most of the material suggests that it was Edward who was pushing for religious reform. Now, Edward is replaced by his Catholic half-sister, Mary I. Mary was the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, often referred to as the Spanish Tudor, and also has earned herself in history the nickname of Bloody Mary. Now, the first rebellion, again, this is slightly on its head one, was actually a rebellion in which Mary was the rebel, because there was a device. Now, this was devised by Northumberland in cohorts with Edward, and it is interesting to look at the interpretation of this. It's actually written in Edward's handwriting, the actual document. But this is about politics and regime change. It's also about religion. So Edward and the Duke of Northumberland, what they do in their device is they alter the line of succession. So what they do is they take Edward's 2 half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, out of the line of succession, and they replace them with Lady Jane Grey, who was a blood relative of Edward, and therefore had royal blood, and also just happened to be married to Guildford Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland's eldest son. What a coincidence! Now, this is definitely partly religious. Edward just didn't want Catholic Mary to get onto the throne and return England to Catholicism. Now, Lady Jane Grey only ruled for 9 days. I mean, you can doubt, maybe you say this is political in terms of Northumberland, or he wants to essentially end up with the royal line under his control. If you look at it from Edward's point of view, and it's religious, well, you ask the question, well, why remove Elizabeth then? Why not just pass the throne to Elizabeth? Well, I think the idea was that the argument that they were using was essentially that neither Mary or Elizabeth were legitimate. It was going to be difficult for them to argue that Mary was illegitimate, but Elizabeth wasn't, and in terms of line to the throne. So with that, essentially Edward it had to put to one side not only Mary but also his favourite sister, Elizabeth, who wasn't religiously massively different from him anyway. In 1554, Mary was going to get married to Philip of Spain, does marry Philip of Spain. But what we see is Wyatt's Rebellion. Now, this is about a potential regime change again, so it's political. And it's political also because it's trying to stop the marriage. It's also religious because of some of the connotations that marriage would have. So Wyatt wanted to stop the marriage between Mary and Philip of Spain. And he threatened to remove Mary and replace her with Elizabeth. Wyatt was Protestant, obviously Elizabeth was Protestant. Elizabeth actually ends up under strong suspicion from Mary, but she can't prove Elizabeth knew anything or was connected to the rebellion. He threatened London. He got to the gates of London, but was defeated. Mary was seen to have acted very calmly and bravely, and so in that she managed to cement her control. And maybe some of the political concerns that Wyatt had were a bit unfounded, because he worried that Philip and Spain would dominate England, and actually the marriage contract gave Mary full control of what happened in England. Moving on to Elizabeth. Well, we're going to see a whole range of rebellions, but obviously Elizabeth's reign is a lot longer than the other ones. Now, a huge amount of this is connected to Ireland, and this is an area which just keeps coming back and keeps coming back. And the first one of our rebellions is one of the many Irish ones. So we've got Shane O'Neill's rebellion. O'Neill loses the earldom of Tyrone to his brother, who he then killed. He then goes on and starts attacking English settlers. Now, I put this down as politics and regime change because it's Irish resistance to English rule. So that part of this is the issue of nationality and politics in terms of Ireland wanting to be independent, and Irish leaders wanting to be independent from English rule. And part of it is religion, because there are settlers, that the English settlers, whenever we see anything with this, the English settlers are being attacked, the English settlers, the English plantations that have been set up in Ireland, mainly in the north, are by Protestants, and the rest of Ireland is Catholic. The biggest rebellion against Elizabeth is the Northern Rebellion, and this is probably the only one really that comes close to the Pilgrimage of Grace in terms of scale. And this is a complicated one. It's known as the Northern Rebellion, or the Rebellion of the Northern Earls. So some of this is political, some of this is religious, some of this is social and economic. So it starts around a complex plot surrounding marrying the Duke of Norfolk to Mary Queen of Scots, who they would free. Mary Queen of Scots was in northern England, but was essentially under arrest at this point in time. They were then going to march with an army that the Earls would raise into Scotland and put Mary back on the throne of Scotland with the Duke of Norfolk as her husband. They would then have children, and their children would become the heirs to Elizabeth's throne, and Elizabeth would have to recognise them as such. The Earls of Westmoreland and Northumberland were behind the rebellion, and their motivation was partly religious. They were Catholic. It was partly political. They felt that they'd been pushed to one side. They'd not been given the political powers and the things that they should have been done. They didn't have control of the Council of the North and things like that. It was partly economics. They had economic gripes, but also you always have to remember with these rebellions, it's not just about the leadership, it's about why everybody else joins. And there are large numbers of people who joined the Northern Rebellion, and some of them joined because of religious reasons, because they wanted to see the return to Catholicism. Some of them joined because of social and economic difficulties that they were going through. Some of them through loyalty to the kind of the people above them, to the Earls who controlled them. They managed to take control of Durham, but the army rather melted away as the Royal Army approached. Northumberland was executed. Westmoreland escaped. There was huge numbers of executions across the whole of northern England. Elizabeth really was absolutely ruthless in putting down this rebellion. The line that I'm going to look at on this this part of the video, again, we've got a whole series of problems in Ireland, so a lot of this kind of runs into each other. This kind of lulls in the middle, and then it kind of all starts up again. So you've got the Munster Rebellion. Again, this is political, socio-economic. So this was rebellions against English plantations. Again, you could argue, because it's English Protestants living in Catholic Ireland, that there's a religious element to that as well. And this rebellion is led by James Fitzmaurice Fitzgerald, who ends up fleeing to France, and there are 800 rebels executed in this. Again, this is a rebellion which takes place over 4 years. One of the major problems in Ireland is Elizabeth never really commits herself with enough men and enough resources to deal with these rebellions that keep taking place. 1579 to 1583, we've got what's known as the Geraldine Rebellion. This is partly religious, partly political. So Fitzgerald returned from France to lead another rebellion, and he's attacking religious and political policy by Elizabeth. Again, he's wanting Irish independence essentially, but and a removal of the Protestant Church. Fitzgerald was killed. Leadership was taken on by the Earl of Desmond. There was some support from Italy and Spain, and even some troops from those countries, but the rebels were defeated, and Desmond was executed. And then the final kind of stage of this, we've got the Tyrone Rebellion, which is 1595 to 1603. And again, it's a rebellion against English rule in Ireland, so it is political. It's led by the Earl of Tyrone. Lord Mountjoy eventually manages to get Tyrone to submit to some kind of peace. I mean, at this point, Mountjoy is trying to rush back, as you can see, the end date 1603. So he wants to go and make sure that the new king knows how good he is and things like that. So it all gets left kind of a bit half done at the end. But Mountjoy done a much better job than compared to the failures of the earlier leaders who'd been sent off to deal with it, particularly the Earl of Essex, who'd made terms with Tyrone against Elizabeth's direct instructions, and then this has consequences, because we'll actually see Essex himself ends up as a rebel. So the last couple of these, you've got the Oxfordshire uprising in 1596, and that was caused by the economic suffering of the people. It is actually surprising in terms of armed uprising. There aren't more like this in Elizabeth's reign, because there was a lot of economic suffering amongst the poor in England. This was a small uprising. There weren't huge numbers of people involved. It was made very clear how dire the consequences were going to be for the leaders of it, and therefore possibly that threat is the reason why there aren't more like it. The Essex Rebellion of 1601, this is about an attempt of regime change. So Essex tries to seize power. Essex was Robert Devereux was his name. He was his stepson of Robert Dudley, the Queen's old favourite, the Earl of Leicester. And he had been indulged by Elizabeth. He gained popular support following some naval victories against the Spanish. But his name had really been sullied by his failure in Ireland, and he'd been publicly disgraced by Elizabeth, and had, for example, his access to his main form of money, which came through a monopoly on sweet wine, and he'd had all his kind of power and privilege and honours and the access to wealth kind of stripped away from him, and so he decided to rebel. And his particular focus was Cecil, who was Robert Cecil, who was in control of Elizabeth's government, and Essex thought he was more popular than he actually was, and it all goes horribly wrong. He thinks London will rise up in support of him. It doesn't. He's defeated. His army's defeated on the streets of London with a small skirmish against the Archbishop of London's men, and then the Bishop of London's men, and then he ends up kind of locked in his house with cannon trained on it, and trying to burn documents. And following all this, he is executed along with those who supported him. So that is a very brief overview of all the different rebellions. As you can see, there are a multitude of causes, and essentially what we're going to be looking at is deciding what is the most significant cause, what is the key thread that runs through that the most. And you might have already been starting to see what you think is the most important in all of these, but are largely focused on the leadership. And remember, it's not only the leaders who get involved in rebellion. So a leader with no support isn't going to get very far. So to answer it fully, you'll need to go into those different rebellions in more detail. But one of the key things is covering the whole time period. You'll notice that there are gaps in this, although that we have got stuff right at the beginning through to stuff right at the end. And so the causes and underlying elements of discontent and socio-economic problems and political issues and religious issues will all underpin all these things as well. So this is going to be on my, well, this is on my coursework playlist, and there's stuff on this element of coursework. There's also stuff on another question which my college does on anti-Semitism in Germany, and there's bits about how you do bibliographies and how you do referencing and how the marking works and all that kind of stuff, and more will be added to that. There's loads of other history, A-level history stuff on my channel. There's also a ton of stuff on A-level politics. So if all that sounds like it might be useful to you or just interesting, then please do subscribe. If you enjoy the video, then please hit like. Thank you very much for watching.